Hey guys, it's Libby, and today I'm doing my August wrap-up. I got through 4 books in August. They were 1 novel, 1 play, 1 audiobook, and I also DNF'd an audiobook. The first book that I finished was one that I borrowed from my parents while I was visiting them in the States, and so I don't have a physical copy, but here's a picture. It is How the Irish Saved Civilization by Thomas Cahill. Now this was published back in the 90s and is the beginning of a series called The Hinges of History, which are about hinges in history. I think Cahill is going for talking about the less flashy times in history. And How the Irish Saved Civilization is about the fall of the Roman Empire and the sorts of classical knowledge that was lost, the changing face of Europe during the Great Migration period, and the Christianization of Ireland, and what this meant for the preservation of classical knowledge. Since sources for this time period are so limited, it's called the Dark Ages for a reason. Actually, I should maybe clarify. The Dark Ages is not called the Dark Ages because they were bad. A dark age is something that is dark to historians, meaning we do not have texts and artifacts to illuminate it for us. But so since we don't really have these, a lot of texts from this period in history, it sort of takes the form of serial biographies of the few people who were writing a lot. The first one was Roman of the very late antiquity named Ausonius. We basically see to what extent the ideas and cultural elements that had built the Greek and Roman nations and empires, to what extent that was preserved in very late antiquity. And then we move to St. Augustine of Hippo, where Cahill talks about how Christianity was affecting the ancient world. And then we move to St. Patrick, the Romanized Celt who Christianized Ireland. So I guess I'm giving it a 5 stars, and when I go back next year to visit my parents, I'll probably read the next one in the series, which is, I think, The Gifts of the Jews. Then I listened to an audiobook with my mom because we were driving all over the place. We live in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., or my parents live in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and we drove to Bethany Beach, which is on the coast of Delaware, and then we drove up to far southwestern Pennsylvania, and then we drove up to the Finger Lakes region of New York, and then we drove back down to DC, and all of those car trips were 3 to 6 hours long, so we had lots of time to listen. And the audiobook that we were listening to was The Custom of the Country by Edith Wharton. Now, I had read Ethan Frome, which is Wharton's novella, in high school, and my mom was an English major, so I think she had read House of Mirth and/or Age of Innocence, but neither of us had read this one before. And we were surprised to hear that this was, by many, considered Edith Wharton's masterpiece, because House of Mirth, Ethan Frome, and Age of Innocence are much better known. So this is about a woman named Undine Spragg. Let's let that sink in. She used to live in Apex City, somewhere in the Midwest, Iowa, Indiana. It's hard to keep them straight. East Coast bias. But she and her parents have moved from Apex City to New York City, and Edith Wharton is writing in the very early 20th century, so that's when it's set. She's trying to look out for a man. I started out not being a big fan of this book, but it gradually and steadily grew on me until I quite liked it. So at the beginning, the first, 3 to 6 chapters, I found very confusing. There were a lot of characters. It was hard to figure out, who's married to who is whose cousin, but then who's having an affair with someone that they're not married to, who does Undine like and who does she not like, who's from Apex and who's from New York City. I was having a really tough time with it. It probably didn't help that during the early chapters my mom was driving, and I may have fallen a tiny bit asleep. So that's probably more my fault. But then the next sort of 5 chapters or so, I found very dull. They're pretty much all about Undine wheedling money out of first her father and then her husband. And I would have been okay with like 1 or 2 instances of that, but just over and over again you see like Undine not really realizing that money is a limited commodity, because her father, like whenever she wants something, initially protests, but eventually just finds somewhere to cut money in order to pay for whatever this thing she wants is. And I think that point was overstressed, especially because it wasn't novel. Like, I've read books before about money-grubbing women. Like, I don't need an entire book about this again. And I was a little bit worried. I was like, is the entire book just going to be Undine getting money out of people? But somewhere along the way, the tune changed. I'd say if you are trying to get through A Custom of the Country or The Custom of the Country, and you find it difficult to get into it first, wait until you've gotten to Paul's birthday party. I think it gets a lot better from there, because you've got this like really stereotyped main character, but from Paul's birthday onwards, Edith Wharton just adds like more and more complications, like more and more perspectives on Undine as a person. So for the first 10 chapters or so, I was like, this is a 2-star book. I don't get it. But, then it found its way becoming a 3 and then a 4. And then I think right now I would give it a 4.5. Possibly if I were to reread it, I might even give it a 5, because I wouldn't have the dread that was inspired in me by the very beginning. Then I read Much Ado About Nothing, which I have right here. Oh, check that out. This was the August play for the Bard Book Club, so I made a whole video all about this play with everything you ever wanted to know. You do have to have read the play in order to fully appreciate the video. Not only because there's spoilers, but because I'm just like jumping all around the plot and you really need to know who the characters are. But just read the play, it's really easy. Or failing that, watch the Ken Branagh film. There are far worse things you could be doing with your life. And then finally, the book that I DNF'd. This was the, I think I can't call it an 18th century novel anymore, or sort of able to get away with that with the Maria Edgeworth ones, which were published in 1800 and 1801. But this book was published in 1804, and therefore is firmly in the 19th century, so I think I'm going to have to start calling these Georgian novels. So this was the next Georgian novel that I was reading. It was Amelia Opie's Adeline Mowbray. And this book had a very interesting premise. It was kind of inspired by the life of the great early feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, and it's basically about this young woman named Adeline. Her father has died, and her mother is going to bring her up herself. And her mother is sort of considered to be a genius. So she has this plan to come up with this great structure, this sort of new approach to education that she is going to provide for her daughter, and her daughter will become like this great, brilliant thinker, and she spends all of her time coming up with this plan. Meanwhile, Adeline is growing up and actually learning how to be a practical, useful person, and also reading the philosophical works of a certain Mr. Glenn Murray, whose his main selling point is that he thinks marriage is unethical, and that people who love each other should not be bound by the law, but they should just live together of their own free will. When Adeline is full grown, she and her mother go to Bath, where they meet one Mr. Glenn Murray, and he and Adeline really hit it off, and they decide to live together in an unmarried state. They are somewhat forced into this by the fact that Adeline's mother is remarrying a total creeper. And then the story is about Adeline and Glenn Murray traveling around Europe on their honeymoon, and then going back to England, and all of the different people that they encounter and how these people react to them and their relationship status. And at first I found this quite interesting, but eventually it really started to drag. I think this book was too long by like a lot. I only got 60% of the way through, and I was really just done. There's basically 3 types of people they encounter. Very rarely they will encounter someone who is sympathetic to them. Then most of the women they encounter react with like disgust, and they do not want to be seen with Adeline because she will ruin their reputation if they hang out with her. And then most of the men are like, oh, you're living together without the marriage bonds. I get what you're saying. Hey, Adeline, when you're done with Glenn Murray, you want to come move in with me? And Adeline and Glenn Murray are totally disgusted by this. Also, Glenn Murray is dying of like unnamed disease. And eventually it got to the point where I could tell that Amelia Opie was just like pointlessly torturing her characters. There was this sequence of events that was just going on for chapter after chapter where it seemed like just the worst thing that could possibly happen. Opie would make it happen to Adeline and Glenn Murray. And I know that the last Georgian novel I read, A Simple Story, I was raving about how like ridiculous it was. But the difference here is that in A Simple Story, the events of the plot were fairly mundane, and people were reacting to them with really big emotions. But in this one, the events of the plot are like really big and ridiculous. And if you know anything about me, you'll know that I'm really into very small plot events which create large emotions, because I honestly think that that's how people live their lives. Like, most of us don't have super interesting things happen to us on most days, but we still feel shit, you know? So yeah, that's Adeline Mowbray. I decided not to give it a rating. Normally I do feel comfortable reading a book that I've DNF'd, normally giving it a 1 or 2 stars, but the topic was really interesting. And I think that it is possible that it could have wrapped up in a more interesting way, but I was not going to stick around to find out. So that was my August. I hope that yours went well. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again soon.